All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the NP Students Podcast. We just kicked off a couple-week conversation this past week on fear, which feels very appropriate given both the fact that we're nearing up on Halloween here and because of the world and culture that we're living in just seems to be a little bit more fearful than maybe 365 days ago at this time. And so we spoke right into that, and we kicked off this past week talking about the fact that while the world might seem angry, it really does seem like it's actually fear that is underneath that. But the reality is that fear isn't the same for everyone. And so some people might even think, oh, I'm not afraid, or I'm not afraid of this season, or I'm not concerned, or whatever it might be. But I think it's important to know, like, we're all afraid of something. We all have a core fear. And we happen to use the tool of the Enneagram this past week, and we're going to use that for this podcast here today. Now, you could use any number of personality tools or whatever you would choose to get to know yourself better. It just kind of gives us a helpful grid to talk about because in the Enneagram, you see 9 different core fears, and you might feel one of those or a couple of those, etc. And then we talked about, like, what do we do in light of that? Like, if we all do have core fears and they come up at different times, like, what do we do in light of that? So we talked about 1 John 4, where John says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. And we talked about how fear and love really can't exist in the same place in the same time. And we want to expand upon that here today to say, like, what does that really mean? Because it doesn't mean just try harder. It doesn't mean just, like, don't think about fear. But it really means to replace it with something else. And to do that, you have to know yourself well. And so we're going to jump into all of those here today. We had a short conversation on the 9 personality types. And today we're going to have a much longer one. And hopefully it's helpful to you guys. And we have a couple of first-time guests here on the podcast today to do that. We have Alex and Shelby here with us. So welcome, guys, to the podcast. And Matt, who's been on a whole bunch of these. What's up, guys? So thanks for showing up as well, Matt.
Thanks, man.
So real quick, before we jump into those, what's cool is we have 4 different, almost half the Enneagrams represented right here. But before we get into our individual ones, I'd love if you guys just shared how you got to be to North Point, because really it hasn't been that long in the grand scheme of things. So maybe Alex, starting with you, just had a birthday a week ago, so happy birthday.
Thank you.
Got us all Starbucks with your Starbucks gift cards from birthdays, so we're all benefiting. But
so I didn't really grow up like in a church. I went to like little vacation Bible schools and stuff when I was younger, and my preschool was like Christian, but I knew who God was, but I didn't really know. I couldn't tell you any like gospels or anything. And my freshman year, I had a group of friends that were coming to Inside Out, and I just remember being so curious, like, where are y'all going? What are you doing? Like, this sounds great. Like, pictures are so cool. Like, and I don't even think they invited me. I think I just went along with it and was like, oh yeah, like, I'll come with you guys. That was in 2018, I think, so almost 2 years ago. And yeah, I just fell in love with Inside Out and the idea of a God and just getting to know about him. I'm a very curious person, so just like learning more and more every week about him was something that I just grew to love. And then I went to My Life. I have an amazing small group. And then wasn't supposed to go to boot camp because of a family trip that ended up getting canceled like a week before the registration closed. And so that was kind of just a sign that it was totally meant to be. Went to boot camp, Camp 75, and just loved every second of it. It was completely life-changing. And here I am.
Mm-hmm. It is a little weird how many stories I hear of, like, I wasn't supposed to be at boot camp. Mm-hmm. Like, how many start off that way?
I feel like there's been 300. I got a family trip canceled.
Yeah.
And I went to boot camp, and it was life-changing.
I tell athletes all the time, like, it's probably the wrong approach to take, but, like, just watch out if you, like, cancel for, a tournament or something, because I've seen so many, like, broken bones, so many, like, I tore something right before, now I can't play, so I'm just going to go to boot camp. And I'm like, you might as well just sign up for boot camp. And because you're going to
so you don't have the injury. Yeah.
So that's awesome. And I know, Shelby, for you, it was pretty similar in terms of not growing up in a church context either. So if you want to share your version of that.
Yeah. I grew up where both my parents, like, they were forced to go to church when I was younger. So I wasn't really like forced to go because they didn't want me to like think of religion or God in that way. And so this made the rest of my family mad because they were all super religious. But I'm really glad that they did that because I wouldn't be here today. But I was always like really curious of the fact of like who God was, or like, you know, I felt like I was kind of like missing out on the whole Sunday school thing. But I realized that like everything changed whenever I was like 8 years old, and my older brother had passed away due to a drug overdose. So in that moment, I was like so far from like God being in the picture of my life, and I was so just not involved with him at all, and I didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so that's kind of how I spent like my life thinking, and like it was very negative, and it was very much like that whole time like I was always really shy, or it was hard for me to make friends, or I would make friends and then it would just like not be great. They wouldn't be great or like healthy friendships. And so I got to high school, and that was really scary for me. And I had met my good friend Faith Leach in my sophomore year history class, and we got to talking a little bit about our lives and like what we thought about everything. And she was like, well, you're going to be forced to go to boot camp. And I was like, no. And then she was like, yeah. So the night, like days after registration, like it was already up. Like I was so just like not going to go. And she called me at like 11:30 at night, and she's like, oh, you're going. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going. And I went, and it was like such an incredible experience. And like that third night of boot camp was when I fully like felt God in my life for the first time ever. And that was like a moment that I just absolutely fell in love with and wanted to continue doing. And from there, it just completely changed my life. I got so much more heavily involved in the church and just surrounded myself with all these new people. I got to meet so many new people, and that's how I'm here today.
Sweet. Yeah, I sometimes I wish I could change my story up, but my story is my story. And so, you know, I've just shared it so many times from stage, and it's always pretty much the same. But, you know, my core passion lies, you know, exactly in what you guys just shared, you know, same experience of not growing up in church, and I had some bad church experiences, etc. But that's why we've created this place. That's why we have conversations like this on this podcast. Mm-hmm. That's why we have Insight Out in Transit, is because, you know, we want to create a place where you can belong before you believe. We want to create churches that unchurched people love to attend. And so I just love that. And I love for anybody tuning in, like this is meant for everybody, whether you'd say you're, you know, a follower of Christ, or you're not sure yet, you're trying to figure that out, or you're against it, but you have a friend, or whatever it might be. You know, our hope is that these conversations are just helpful wherever you're at. So thank you guys for sharing that. And thank you guys for hopping on today. Mm-hmm. And your Enneagram numbers are, if you want to share with the group.
I'm a 6.
I'm a 2.
I'm an 8.
And I am a 3. Wing 2, I guess. You know, the wings are confusing. Also, this is a good clarification point for people. Your wing can only be the number on either side of you. You know, so yeah, I'm just trying to save you. If you go talk to a friend about what the Enneagram is, and you're like, I'm a 1 wing 7. You're
I'm an 8 wing 4.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, come on,
Yeah.
no, you're not.
No, you're not. Liar. I just want to, like, you know, help you out, and, you know, if you're gonna go public with that. But anyways. It's good to know. What we're going to do, so in the message this past week, I just spent, you know, a couple minutes, probably not, you know, as efficiently as maybe I'd intended to, but just a couple minutes on each of these types and what the core fear is for each. And, you know, now because we kind of have this, you know, freedom kind of the, you know, not you know, tied down to a specific length of time here, just want to dive into each of them and talk about, like, one, what the core fears are, and then also what it is that we can actually do about that once we know what our core fear is. But I think, you know, it's a starting point. It's just getting to know yourself well to say, like, okay, I'm going to be triggered by these situations or these circumstances, et cetera, because of my core fear. And the very first one on there, the first type 1, which we don't have represented around the table, although I believe that Carson is, who was on our last podcast. I think she is a 1. The type 1 core fear is basically imperfection. So it's messing up, being corrupt, being bad, being, you know, something's wrong with you, like something's fundamentally broke with you, something's weird about you. You know, that's like the core fear of a 1. And on this resource here, it says the why you fear is that somewhere along the way, you picked up the message that you must be better than you are. You're an idealist at heart, so you believe that anything that's flawed can and should be fixed, including you. So that's the type 1 core fear. And we're going to kind of go back through all of these and talk about like what does it look like in terms of inviting God in, or what does it look like to take a step with each of these. But the other interesting thing about the Enneagram is you're not like 100% one type and 0 any of the others, right?
Yeah.
So there's going to be elements of these that like we all relate with. And I think the idea of being a perfectionist is probably something that a lot of people can connect with, even if it's not your core or your prime. That idea of like something about my life isn't perfect and I'm afraid, people are going to criticize me for that or see that in me, etc. I think would be like a very common, fear. The second then is the helper. And we do have a type 2 here at the table in Shelby. So do you want to talk about what your core fear is as an Enneagram 2?
Yeah, so basically as a 2, you are like afraid of being like rejected or being alone in a situation, in like friendships or family or school, or just like not really being good enough, I guess, to meet somebody's expectations, scared of being by yourself, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting how the fears are so tied to the desires as well. Like you desire to help,
Right.
To be helpful to others, to add value to other people's life. And so if you feel like you can't do that, so you
It's
feel
terrifying.
like, people don't want your help, your
Yeah.
free services, if you're like, hey, you don't want me around, you don't want to be friends with me, I can't add value to you. Like, you're like, well, what else is my purpose? Like, what else is my point?
Yeah.
Right. That's why it's so, deeply tied to who we are. So that is a 2. And it seems like I'll talk about this actually when we get to the 6, but it seems like 2s are a very like highly represented one in church world sometimes.
Yeah.
And there might be some reasons for that. But I'll talk more about that in a couple of seconds.
Yeah.
The 3 is the achiever. And I am a 3. And so basically what we fear is failure. We fear basically people finding out we're not all that we present ourselves to be, right? Because the 3 is an achiever, a performer, which means like I want to have an image that says like, oh, I work really hard, or I do really good, or I accomplish, whatever I set out to do. But then we have this fear that we're really not that. That's actually like why we work hard, is because we're like, oh, I messed up. I don't want anybody to know that. And so I'm going to like work really hard so people think differently and have this good image of me. So kind of the big fear is, well, now I fail and everybody sees who I really am. And that's a really tough battle as a 3, because we think, man, the failure is who I am, not like a deviation of who I am. So this is, one thing I've even worked through in counseling and stuff is like, okay, if I fail, that's not a representation of who I am. That's actually a deviation from who I am, but I see it as the opposite. I see it as like any of the good stuff, that's just fake. I'm just coasting, I'm faking it. But man, when I make a mistake, when I fail, now people have like really seen me. And if they do, well, now they're, not going to want to be friends. Now they're not going to want me in their life, because they're like, the only value I add was when I was performing well.
And I think that's super interesting too. Like the fear part of a 3 is all about identity based. And I think all of us around the table and everybody listening is like, nobody wants to fear. Like, I think we all have like a little bit of sense of the fear of failure, but when it comes to you, your fear of failure comes from a place of identity.
Yeah.
And not just more or less of, it is performance too, but like, I think for all of us, our fear of failure is more just like performance, but we shake it off and we go again.
Yeah.
And for you, it's more identity based, which is interesting.
I think it's great. I think that, why it's called a core fear is really helpful. I mean, the same thing we were talking about being a helper. Well, if I can't help, then what do I, I'm like, well, if I can't perform, or I didn't perform well, like, well, what else, why else am I here?
Right.
Like, so I love that these are all really tied to our identity, and that's a great point. 4s, which our guest services director, Inside Out, is a 4. But a 4 is the individualist, and a 4 basically fears like not being unique, not bringing something to the table, right? Your underlying fear is being abandoned, and by God and others, because you really are too much. You fear being misunderstood, dismissed, and stereotyped. Deep down, you want to be understood and loved for the individual you are. There's kind of a disproportionate amount of 4s that are like creative types, etc. They really like stand out. They want to be known for like kind of making a difference or doing something different, unique, etc. And so kind of like fitting into the crowd, etc., just kind of blending in, being like unnoticed is a really big fear of a 4. The 5, it's called the investigator, and the type 5 fear, it says your underlying fear is that you won't be able to function successfully in the world. You fear being helpless, incapable, not having all the information, and feeling out of control of your circumstances. Deep down, you want to be capable and competent. So there's a lot of 5s that are like really smart. They're really well read. A lot of 5s great with like math. A lot of 5 accountants in the world. That
I'm
kind
not
of stuff.
5.
You are a smart man. You are a street smart man. That's the 5. And then the 6, which we do have a 6 here at the table, is the loyalist. Do you want to summarize a little bit of what the core fear of a 6 is, Alex?
So for a 6, it's kind of just like the fear of fear, and just to kind of picture or imagine the worst, and like the worst that could happen in any situation, and pretty much. I mean, I think that's, you're just scared of everything almost.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I know maybe a little bit more about a 6 than a lot of them on there, because I'm married to a 6. Emily is a 6, and she talks about, you know, that exact same thing, like the fear of fear, to be in a state where you are afraid. Like safety and security are really big, like losing safety and security. You know, so that kind of core is huge to a 6, which is, we're like an interesting pair as far as that goes, because like it's almost like my imagination works to all the best case scenarios. Like I imagine all the ways I could achieve or all the things I should do better. Her imagination works like in the exact opposite direction. She's like incredibly creative in the way the world could end. You know what I mean? It's like here's all the here's all the ways this could go wrong. And so I think to a degree we really, you know, balance each other out well. But it's an interesting pairing for sure. What I was going to say about the represented thing is there's not like hard research on this or anything to say that there is, but it is said by a lot of people that do a lot of work with the Enneagram or that write books on the Enneagram that the 6 may be the most common type, which is interesting to me because it may just be that I haven't asked or don't know enough, but in church world specifically, it seems that there's a lot of 2s, a lot of 3s, you have like a lot of helpers, a lot of achievers, etc. And I don't feel like I come across as quite as many 6s. But knowing Emily, what's interesting is like being a loyalist, like I think it is a little bit easier to be skeptical about the world as a 6. Like you have to guard that a little, because you could see how all the things could go wrong, you know? And so I think it's easy for a 6 to like walk into church and like think about all the reasons why you might be let down, or why this, you know, person or this group or this pastor, you know, whatever, is ultimately going to let you down at the end of the day, because, you know, your mind or creativity kind of goes in that direction. So I just thought that was interesting to think, even how we started this podcast, say like our vision is to create churches that unchurched people love to attend, that there might be a lot of 6s, you know, they're in that category, that it's like, hey, how do we, you know, win your trust, and how do we meet 6s where they're at? So that's just an interesting, that may be untrue, it's just an observation that I've had. A type 7, I think this is an interesting one in that I don't know if you can like go through like middle school and high school without resonating with the core fear of a 7. I don't know if we all have some 7 in us, or it's just something about that stage of life that brings it out in you. But basically a 7's core fear is missing out. You know, it's and I think a lot of this like season has to be hard on a 7, you know, because they're typically very extroverted, like love being in crowds, love having fun. They're usually the life of the party. And so to have to be like isolated and away from people all the time, to have like really cool big events canceled, I mean, this season would be really, really hard on a 7. I think there's something about middle school and high school, though, where like so much of your life is similar to the people around you, like similar schedules, and, you know, you're doing similar stuff and you're all like graded on the same scale. Once you get like out of college, like people's lives go in all kinds of different directions. And I don't know if like fear of missing out is quite the same. Like I remember when I was in high school, my first job was at a gym, and I had like the Friday night shift because I was like the new guy, and missing football games, I was like sick to my stomach. stomach. You know, it was just this like, all my friends are at the game. They're all having an amazing time. Even though a lot of people go to football games do not have a great time. They're like bored and everything. But like, you know, to me, I was just picturing people having the time of their life, and I have to like be back here and I'm missing out. It's terrible. Now, like as I grow up, I'm like, my couch is great. Like, you know, like I don't need to like be in like a huge, you know, crowd. I love watching UT from my couch now, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I think there's, everybody has to go through a period where that fear of missing out feels very, very strong and relevant. And then we do have an 8.
We do.
The Challenger.
Heck yeah.
So do you want to tell us what the type 8 core fear is?
Yeah, our core fear is being controlled, or having someone else lead us, or, you know, having someone else control us in our lives. A lot of people, it's a misconception about an 8, like we're, you know, mean people, or we don't smile a lot. And some of that's true, but a little bit of that is just more or less of if something's going wrong in our own lives, if we feel controlled in an area, if we feel dominated in an area, a lot of times we just kind of retreat from people. We want to be our own thing. We want to be independent. We don't want to, you know, be dependent on people too much. I like to think of it as like a puppeteer and a puppet. We want to be the puppeteer. We don't want to be the puppet. We want to be the one controlling things. We want to be the one in charge of all the things in our lives. Think of it too, if you're a sports person, like you want to be, you know, Bill Belichick, you want to be Tom Brady. You don't want to be an offensive lineman. You want to be the one who is in control, calling the plays, doing everything you possibly can to move your team down the field. But yeah, so that's like my core fear, and 8's core fear is like having someone else, like we have to be dependent on someone else to move our lives forward. And so that's our core fear.
Yeah. Man, I should dive into your Enneagram a little bit more. I have probably the potential to cause a lot of stress in your life.
You stress me out more than you know. And it's fine. Like, I love being on the other side of you. You just, I'm glad you realized that.
It's like, wow, I should like get a book on an 8 or something. I'm shaving years off his life. Okay, that's good. And then a 9 is a peacemaker. So a 9's underlying fears is really the opposite of peace, more or less. You know, it's relational tension, unresolved conflict, loss, etc. And so, you know, deep down, they really want to feel at peace, and things that kind of disrupt peace cause a lot of tension and conflict and fear for a 9. So any of those that you guys feel like you really resonated with that aren't your specific like core type when you think through some of those? So I know we have like a 6, 2, 3, 8 here, but did any of this come up for you? Like for me, the perfectionist one, it's like, you know, I'm not a 1, but the perfectionist one's big, or FOMO. You know, does any of those like come up for you guys as like having weight?
Definitely for me, 7 is a big one, because as much as I love, like, you know, I hate being alone, so I love being with people and being isolated. I was like, gosh, I hate this. I hate not being able to, like, you know, go with my friends. And, like, you know, ACL just got canceled. Like, we can't go to ACL. Like, so much, like, no homecoming parade. Like, that's still going on today. And, like, that's so scary to think about, that you're just like, wow, this year is so different from any other year, that, like, you never realized how scary it is to miss out on opportunities that were just so normal.
Yep, 100%.
I was going to say the same. Just, like, being so busy, like, church and, like, work all the time, dances. I find myself getting, like, not being able to go to things a lot of the time. Like, tonight there's a football game, but I have work. So it's, like, it's those moments where you're like, oh, man, like, that really sucks. But it almost feels like, to me, that things getting canceled is starting to become more normal.
Oh, yeah.
Like, all of our dance stuff was canceled, and, like, those are things we've been working towards for
Forever.
For the whole year. And, like, homecoming is just not the same, and, like, all these things. It's, I don't like missing out on it, but it almost feels so normal for something to get canceled.
Yeah.
And it's so weird now, because, like, you know, I feel busier now with, like, online school and, like, work and church and, like, everything like that than I did, like, when I had all those opportunities and I actually went to school, like, from, like, 7 to 4 p.m. or 3:45, and then I would, like, you know, if I had church, I'd come here after school, or, like, I just got a job, so, like, now I go to my job. But it's, like, I feel like now, since the world is so crazy, and, like, your fear of missing out is more towards, like, oh, you already know this is going to get canceled. And it's like everything that's outside of school right now feels more important than actual school. So your fear of missing out is, like, things are involved with school that are, like, you're like bottom priority, which
Yeah.
is so weird now.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, are there things that are different today? Like, are there fears that you would say you had today that if we were doing this podcast a year ago, maybe it wouldn't have been relevant, or even if this was in January? You know, are there new fears or fears that seem like bigger to you guys today than they did before the season?
I can start. Yeah, I think for an 8, when it's like coming to right now, I don't have control. Like, I don't know what tomorrow's gonna hold. I don't know what next week's gonna hold. And there's nothing more that I would want right now than just to know what my life's gonna look like in the next 3 months. And I just don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing. And I think it's an underlying fear. I don't think I show it a lot, but I definitely feel stress and anxiety putting my head on my pillow at night and not knowing, like, okay, you know, the state of our world, you know, the state of anger, the state of everything going on. And I definitely feel that stress and anxiety, like, you know, the less I'm around people, and the more I'm just by myself, I'm like, man, I really don't have a lot of control in what's happening right now. And that's kind of like, you know, stressing me out.
Yep.
I think for me, I've always been scared, of course, of like losing people or like being alone, like having a friendship like break apart, or like we get in a fight and it doesn't work anymore. Like, that is like so painful for me to go through, because it's like one of my biggest fears is like having someone that I love like not be in my life anymore. And that is so crazy now, because, you know, since we were isolated, like I had all that time to think about myself, which I never did, and I like never got to see the people that I loved. And so now, even though like I was of course like afraid of like losing people I loved, I'm so much more cautious of it now, because everything is so uncertain. Like we genuinely, we don't have control of what happens tomorrow. Or like, you know, I was in practice this morning and my coach was saying, well, you know, like another football game got moved, and I wish I could tell you guys like I know when the next game is, but I genuinely don't. And it's like that's just how we live now. And like not knowing that like I could go to like the grocery store and get sick and then come home and get my family sick. That is absolutely terrifying to me. I absolutely hate that.
Yeah.
And so it's just like I never would have thought of that a year ago, but now it's like all I think about.
Sure.
I'm the same, like, sorry. I'm the same way, just like you could go to sleep and wake up the next morning and the world could be shut down again. Like, you just never know when someone's going to get COVID, or, I mean, same thing with dance is stuff gets moved all the time. Stuff is canceled, things you've been working towards for so long, it's just gone. And, I mean, there's 45 of us, 50 of us on a team. One of those girls is, like, we're all living life and going. You have to go to the grocery store. You have to go to school. Like, you never know. It's not their fault, but somebody's going to get it. And, like, for 2 weeks, your life is just spent in your room. And that is so scary to me, is that, like, all these, like everything could just, like, stop tomorrow. Or, you know, like, you just never know what's going to happen, which is really scary.
And I know you were talking about before we had started that you actually feel more of that now than when the world was kind of all in quarantine in March, April, that kind of time frame, right? You said it's increased for you a little?
I mean, whenever I was quarantined, I felt great. I mean, I had like a routine. I'd work out. I would read my Bible, have time with God 3 times a day. Like, it was great. I was living my best life, had no worries, no fears. I mean, I missed my friends and I missed my life and I missed the things that were canceled and all the big events that we obviously couldn't have had. But I never felt any anxiety or stress or like, okay, like I'm going to go out and this could happen, or because everyone was on lockdown pretty much. Like, there was no way for someone to give me COVID or for me to get it to my family. Like, I was already stuck in my room, so I just felt so much more, like, secure. And I think for a 6, that is, you fear not being secure and safe. But in those months, I was the safest I've ever felt. And so now, not having that security all the time, where you have these things that you have to go do, and I'm very much a person, I will overfill my plate until it is overflowing. I am always busy. And so, yeah, it's just, I don't feel that security all the time as much as I did.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I feel similar to that. Emily and I do both. Like, you know, we've talked about that. Even the FOMO aspect, I feel like, was actually really low in that season because like nobody was doing fun stuff. Like everything was canceled. Like, there wasn't. And now all of a sudden we're back into this world is kind of functioning, and now there's all these things exactly what you guys have been talking about, what the implications of, and what do you have to quarantine, what if you miss a big event, like all that kind of stuff is back and ramped again. So yeah, it's really interesting how this time hits different personalities. What I want to do for a second now is I want to go like comb back through the 9 personality types and talk about, okay, specifically, what do you do about each of those? Because again, I think we have multiple of those fears in each of us. What we talked about in part 1 and Inside Out was we talked about 1 John 4, and specifically what I had read was John says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." And we talked about how important that is, and it's kind of an interesting side point because of the fact that like we're in this fear message, yet we're talking about what love is and why do we start with that. But it said it's very important that love is not God, but that God is love, meaning when love is God, just be nice to each other and love everybody, but we have like no definition for love. Well, that gets really confusing because we use the word love to say we love all kinds of things, like we love fast food and we love sports and we love our family, and then we use this word without a definition. But if God is love, then we have a definition of what love is. We have an example of what love really is, and we have guidelines and parameters for that, and also what is not loving. And then it says in verse 9, "This is how God shows his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." Meaning God made the first move. This is how we know that it is love, because he came after us. He pursued us first. It's not something that we did to earn the love. It's not because we climbed a ladder to God's love, but instead he made the first move and he came to us because we were stuck in our sin. There was nothing that we could do about it. And then in verse 18, he says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear." And we started to unpack that in terms of what does that mean, almost like, if you were to think about it, like physically being in a place, like you are in a place of love or you're in a place of fear, but you really can't be in both in the exact same moment. We shared that really cool quote from Elizabeth Ross, who came up with the stages of grief, and she talks about how the two are actually opposites of one another. And so the reason I want to take that as a framework and go back through them is because this is not about like just trying hard not to be afraid. You can just like control your emotion like that. This isn't like a willpower thing. There's something that has to be discovered first. There's connection that has to happen first, etc. And so what's cool about this is like this is as close as you can get to like a one-stop shop, a silver bullet, like the magic pill that just kind of solves all of it. I say solve, helps us navigate it. This is the only thing that we can look to be like, this meets all of our fears regardless of what our fear is. And so when you go back through the order, when you start with a 1, and you talk about like the fear of being imperfect, the fear of being messed up, the fear of being broken or wrong. Well, when you've placed your trust in Christ, or if you have, or if you're considering that and you think about that, the moment that takes place, like now you're seen as righteous. You're seen as a new creation. You are not seen as broken. You are not messed up. You are not flawed, because God looks at you and he sees what Jesus has already done for you. And all of a sudden you have a new identity in that. Now you're going to have to remind yourself of that. That doesn't mean like, oh, I'm never afraid again as a 1. And there might be reasons why, as you live life, you actually become more afraid and all that kind of stuff. But that is what you have to like now keep going back to say like that meets my core fear.
I think the 1 too just needs to allow them to have grace for themselves. Like, what you do is not going to be perfect. What you think is not going to be perfect, but you need to remind yourself that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. And when you allow yourself to have that grace for yourself, you give yourself some slack to not hold yourself to a higher standard, but the standard that God set for you, and that you're fearfully and wonderfully made.
100%. Yeah, it goes back to, I like what you brought up earlier, Matt, like the identity piece, I love that. Then a helper, so a 2, and then, if you can add to anything about this, about how this has been helpful to you. But a helper is to say, you're afraid of being rejected, or you're afraid of being unwanted. well, God has literally moved heaven and earth to say, I want you, to
Yeah.
say, I want a relationship with you. Like I've done everything I can to remove every barrier and prove my love for you and a desire to be in a relationship with you. So in what way for you, like, would you say like knowing that is comforting, like inviting God in is comforting for you?
Yeah, definitely I struggle with anxiety like every day. And knowing that like my core fear is so heavily involved in my life every single day, having that moment of just like breathing time or just like that time with God, even if it's just like praying before bed, talking to him, talking about what I went through today, talking about what I was scared of, and just getting that reassurance, or, you know, reading your Bible, like getting that reassurance that he made me to like strive and help people. And my fear of being alone should not allow me to stop the things that I love to do every day. And knowing that he is always there for me, and that his love is like all that I need in life, is so reassuring, even if I don't feel it all the time.
Yeah.
Just having that moment of just like taking a breather, pushing everything away, and just spending that like undivided attention to God is so helpful.
Wow. Yeah, and I love that, like, what you just talked about is, like, getting at our fear at, like, the root, at, like, the core. You know, there's some things we can do to try to manage it or ignore it, but, like, you do what you just talked about, and over time, like, you're addressing the core, like, the root of our fear. That's so cool. The 3, then the achiever for me, you know, so this is about the performer, this is about being successful. For me, like, realizing that, 1, my identity is not in my performance is, like, the most freeing thing. And to know, like, we win in the end. Like, I know how this all ends. Like, I'm afraid of failing or messing up, or what if I mess up somebody else's life or whatever. Well, like, I know at the end of the day, like, heaven is coming. I know Jesus has already won and my identity is in him. But I'm so passionate about this as a 3, because it's just obviously the one I've done the most work with, to say what's so wild about this is I actually perform better. I work better when I am, you know, rooted in where my identity really should be, which is like this fascinating thing, because when I'm like, you know, really self-centered and focused and like worried, like what does everybody think of me, the anxiety becomes overwhelming, you know, and it's like, you know, works against, you know, I think about like message prep, for example, and speaking for 10 years now, and I still get nervous every single time I write and sit down and look at that blank screen. But when I'm worried about like, what do people think about me, or this is going to suck, or this is going to be boring, well, that's just like a trapped place. But when I think about like, my identity is not in this message, my identity is in Christ, like that's never going to change. Well, now it can be helpful to people. Now it's freeing, the anxiety lightens, and it actually gets better. It's this really weird thing about like when we find our identity in Christ, it actually like allows us to be who God created us to be. So that's a 3. A 4, the individualist, like, you know, thinking about, you know, afraid of being unique. Like, God knows like your name specifically. He knows every single hair on your head. He individually created you. You know, you're his son, you're his daughter. I think that's like incredible to think about, you know, how God individually knows you in this whole universe. The 5, like not having what it takes, you know, not being competent, you know, that fear. Well, God lives inside you. Like think about his power, his wisdom, like he walks with you every single day. Like you are able to be with him in every single moment.
One of the comforting verses about that, and again, I'm not a 5, but like Romans 8, there's a verse that if if God is for us, who can be against us? And I think that works perfect for a 5, because they're always strategically trying to figure things out, and what are they bringing into the world, and how am I going to function successfully in this world? And that Romans 8 verse of like, hey, if God is for you, if God really knows you by name, if God has a plan for your life, nothing in this world, no person, no situation can ever be against you. And so I think that's so helpful for 5s.
Yeah. Yeah. The 6 then, you know, in terms of safety, in terms of security, in terms of all the worst case scenarios, how would you say that God can really, or the gospel like really meets a 6 where they're at?
I mean, why does it keep happening? It's totally like easier said than done, for sure. You just have to like place your trust completely in God, and I so firmly believe like everything happens for a reason. God is working even when you can't see it, and it's so easy to forget that when you're scared and when your mind is just overthinking constantly, like this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. But you have to remember, like, okay, like I just have to like take a step back and just think like, you know, like everything's gonna be okay. If it does happen, like obviously there's a reason that God has put you through this, and he'll definitely gets you out of it. And so that's something that it's not easy for sure. And I think for everyone, fear is, it doesn't define you, and you have to know that. And it's definitely easier just to be like, oh, like, it's not a big deal, like, it's fine, I'll push it aside. But you have to remember, like, you have to find the root of it. It's just like, where is this happening, and what can I do to, like, fix it, and really just place my trust in God to know that I'm secure no matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing. And it's just finding that moment of, like, when you can connect with him and find that time to be with him and really build that trust so that you never feel like you're unsecure with him.
Yeah, the 6 is such I feel like we could, like, all kind of learn something from a 6 when it comes to, like, what does it mean to trust God? Because, for you, you're thinking about these worst case scenarios, and some of them may happen. Like, it's not trusting that, like, all of the circumstances are going to be great. This is different than that. Emily talks about that all. I've learned so much from her, because I used to kind of use that phrase as, like, a comforting thing, like, God has a plan. She's like, well, what if his plan is, like, you die in a car accident tonight? Like, that could happen. She lost her mom young, and she's like, well, that's never been comforting for me from the perspective that there will be no, like, pain in my future. But him having a plan means it's starting to trust who he is, trusting his character, trusting that he does make good come out of bad situations, trusting that heaven is real, that, hey, like, this world was really never meant to be perfect, but the culmination of everything we hope for is in heaven. And ultimately, if I try to trust in myself and me controlling the world, well, you don't have to live very long to know that you can't do that. So, how is that going to help you versus, like, trusting in who he is? So, super complicated, but it also is such a great distinction between it. It's not trusting that everything's always going to go exactly the way you wanted it. That's not what we're saying either.
I definitely, like, feel a 6 so hard because I am one that worries about absolutely everything on the face of the earth. And I'm actually really surprised that I'm not a 6. But I find comfort in knowing also that, like, knowing that everything's in God's hands and it is God's plan. Like, I feel like some wise person once told me this, and they said, what if is not it is. It's not just because what if this happens, it's not this is happening. This is going to happen to you. You can find comfort in knowing that even though it is uncertainty, not everything that is a what if will happen to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it robs you the joy of, like, every moment too. I've been on the side of so many people, who have experienced tragedy, and some in my own life, and just, like, the fearing the scenario didn't help prepare you for the scenario.
Right,
It didn't, like, oh, well, this was easier to lose this loved one because I imagined it so many times. It's when that moment comes, and it's just, it's, the most painful of circumstances, as opposed to, like, enjoying the moments that you do have with those people and gratitude for those moments. And so there's so much in that. A 7, then, the fear of missing out, or the, let's see, they have underlying fear is pain. You fear not having options. You fear missing out on new experiences and people, not getting to do all the things. There is so much with the 7 that's met in terms of, one, I love this concept that the more, like, we focus on eternity, like, the more we focus on where we're going. A 7 could never do all the things they want to do in this lifetime, or talk to all the people, or meet all the people, but they get to do that for the rest of eternity. Yeah. I mean, heaven is a real thing, a real place, a physical place, physical relationships, and part of that, meets all of that. I also think that, like, God isn't a means to an end. It's not like the more that I get to know God, the more people I get to meet or whatever. But, like, God is the end. And even if I can't meet every person on the planet, or not, I can't have fun with every person on the planet like a 7 would want to do, like, I have access to God in any moment. And so if I am locked down in isolation or whatever, like, God is in this room with me, and I still get to spend time with him, and I'm not missing out on anything when I'm with him and in his presence in that moment. And then an 8, Matt, if you want to talk to us about how God meets that.
God meets that through the gospel in our stillness. So when our lives are usually chaotic, we like to pack our schedules as much as we possibly can. And so when we have opportunities to be still, God meets us in those moments, and he becomes very more real. His words become more real to us. And so really good example of this is about 2 months ago, we were in this, online season trying to, make things happen. And I'm leading a team of about 12, 13 people. And I go to Jordan and I say, I need a break. Like I need a rest. Like I feel chaotic and I feel like I don't have that control right now. And you were so gracious giving me like a weekend vacation, and I tried to do a tech-free weekend. So after this podcast, I highly suggest do tech-free for a little bit, for a little while. And I go down to the beach by myself because I just want to hear from God, and I want to hear what he has for me. And I go tech-free, and in that moment, I feel closer to God. I feel my fears start to alleviate. I feel like I can trust in him. He is my puppeteer. He is the one leading me in this moment. And really the high level of that is just like, eights really just need to let God be the leader in their life. We all have this itch to be the leader in charge, having everything done, and having a plan for our own lives. And so the closer we can get to God, the more we can actually realize that he's the one leading our lives, and he's the one who has good things for us. And so last thing I'll kind of say about that, this might dive a little bit away from the Enneagram, but I want to talk specifically to the dudes who are listening right now. During that beach trip, I read a book called Fathered by God by John Eldredge, and it talks about the stages of manhood, boyhood, becoming a man, and how God leads us in each of those stages. And so if you want to talk more about the book, we can talk more outside the podcast, but I highly suggest, guys, if you are searching for how God could be the leader in your life, Fathered by God by John Eldredge is a fantastic book. And I read that entire book in like 8 hours on the beach, and it was awesome. And so I highly suggest that.
There are so many things in that, almost that are like countercultural right now. I think that's why I like speak so much about like what a man needs. I think it's so cool. Mm-hmm. Well, a mentor in my life is an 8 as well, and I thought it was a unique perspective that an 8 would bring to say, so often we're kind of self-centered and focused in this whole conversation of like, how does God meet my fears or my needs and all that? With an 8 who feels a lot of protection over the, kind of their core circle, maybe not the whole planet, but like, your people or your family. He talked to me about how part of the trusting God process is trusting that like God is over, looking those other people as well. Again, that doesn't mean like always their permanent safety and stuff, but the plan for their life and their eternity and all those things. So part of an 8 trusting God is not just for their own life, but for those that they care about too. Absolutely. And that's an interesting thing to think about. And then the 9, finally, the fear of being separated from others, from loss, from tension, that kind of thing. They're called the peacemaker. What they so desire is peace. And Jesus is literally called the Prince of Peace. Like, the only thing that is going to bring like true peace, both in this life and in the next, is him, is a relationship with our Heavenly Father in those truly still moments, and those truly like, I'm giving up all of these fears and anxieties to you. And so he is quite literally the only thing that could bring the peace that a 9 is looking for. So I just think it's so interesting, because if we're just like, hey, trust God, well, that means something really different based on like what fear looks like for you. And hopefully that helps, unpack and kind of clarify that a little bit further. Anything that you guys would say, I think we're probably, real close to the end of our time here, but anything just from a practical perspective that we didn't hit that helps you, focus on these things are true, that helps you navigate your fears, perhaps helps you, stay connected to Christ, or become, more aware about or curious of some of our own fears.
I was just going to say, like, finding those people in those moments that you find, like, safety and security, and you find, like, you can really trust in God with people or in a certain situation. Like, I know for me at Camp 75, every fear is gone that you could ever think of. Like, I know for a lot of people, I mean, it might be very different, because some people, their fear is being around groups of people like that, or they're not comfortable. But for me, where you just fear, like, situations that could happen and you feel the worst, whenever you're at Inside Out or at Camp 75 or boot camp, it's so hard to find those moments of, wow, this could go wrong, because you feel God so heavily. Yeah. And it's also just about finding those people that will sit down and read the Bible with you, or a small group that you can just trust so much and being like, hey, like, this is going on, and they'll just help you until you feel 100% better. And obviously things are meant to do on your own, like finding the root of your fear, but people can help you. And I really have found that my small group and people just at North Point have helped me just grow. I'm a complete different person from every experience just being at North Point. And I really think that being with God and finding that trust and finding those people in those places can 100% help you.
I love that you said that, and I love the perspective that you had as a good reminder for me, probably for you too, that students feel that at Camp 75. Because for me, I would say I feel anything but fearless at Camp 75, being responsible for 500 students. There's a lot of things that could go wrong in my head.
While she was talking, I was thinking of like 500 things. Like last time where
I was like, oh, I'm glad.
I'm glad y'all feel that way. But
that's what we hope for.
I love that. That's awesome. That's cool. Something I'll add to just like any advice is a lot of times when fear creeps into our lives, so whatever Enneagram you are, 1 through 9, when fear creeps into our lives, it's easy to not quote unquote feel God. I know that's a loose term, but it's easy to not feel connected with God in that moment. And so when someone says, if I'm meeting on the other side of anybody, a student, adult, and they're like, man, all these things are going on in the world, culture, society, I'm seeing a lot of things, I'm fearful right now, and I just can't feel God right now. I just can't feel him. I can't see him working in my life. My number one response to that is like, hey, have you spent time with him? Do you know he wants to be connected with you? Do you know he wants to drive out your fear? Like 1 John, perfect love drives out fear. Like that's what he wants to do in our lives, and that's how the gospel meets us. And so for an 8, that's so helpful to me, because like when I can be still and know that God has the best for me, to know that he wants to take away my fear, to know that Jesus on the cross literally took away every disconnection I could ever have with God. That is what is most helpful for me. And I think that just is a people thing, especially in today's culture, the things that the world kind of provides for us. It's scary, and it's okay to be scared of those things. And naturally, it's our instinct, especially for students, to say, well, I can't see God working right now. And I just think that is the furthest thing from the truth. And I just think the more time we know him, the more time we spend with him, the better it actually goes.
Yeah, I think... were you about to say something?
You can go ahead.
Okay.
It's totally okay.
No, you go first, and then I'll wrap us here.
Okay. I have 2 things. So I have noticed, like, especially since like being in quarantine and everything, like this sounds absolutely terrifying, but doing the thing that you are most afraid of is going to like open this like door to like who you are and like why you're afraid of it, and like doing your core fear, like Jordan said, like you get scared every single time before you do a message, but you still do it. So you face that fear every single time that you go on, and that makes you a stronger person. So like doing what is scaring you the most in life is like, I feel like so crucial to finding out who you are. And also I think this could work with like literally any Enneagram type, and like not letting that fear control you is so important. And I think that being able to like get involved with your community, or like being able to like, even if it's just like if you are just not a church person whatsoever, find the thing that makes you the most happiest, like, and like evaluate why that makes you so happy, and like be able to like spread that with people, because that will make your fears less scary, and it like will help develop who you are as a person and help spread like what others think of you as like a person, and I think that's so important in this time right now, especially just like doing what makes you the happiest, even if it's not what you had planned it to be, and just being like grateful for that like God is giving you this opportunity to find out who you are, and to like find out what's making you happy due to the type of person that you are.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I feel like what you're speaking to is what you brought up, like that connection, the couple things that are on mine. And I really think if you're listening to this, probably just choose one of these, because I know we just threw out a whole bunch of things you could go do and try. So, and try all 8 of the things we're suggesting or whatever. But to me, there's a direct correlation with connection. And I think that's what you're saying, and that's what you were talking about. And to pay attention to what you are connected to. Because if you just notice, like, man, when I get off of, Instagram for, an hour or, whatever I was just on, like, do I feel like, more afraid now that I just like saw all these kind of worst case scenarios, or do I feel less afraid, versus like when I'm hanging out with people or hanging out with my small group or whatever. I think that's so interesting to say, like, what are we connected to? And I think I'm in full agreement with you, Matt. The more you're connected to your Heavenly Father, the smaller you're going to see that fear go. And I think I would just encourage people, I think the younger you start this kind of habit, the more it will benefit you in the long run. And I'm talking, it's probably going to culminate a little bit later in life for most people listening to this, but developing a habit of curiosity is something that is so interesting. It's just curious about why I am afraid of the things that I am, because it's probably rooted in some things deeper than we really think about or realize. There's, things from our childhood. There's things that have happened to us. There's circumstances that we've been in. And to some degree, like, we're in that. If you're in middle school or you're high school and you're listening to this, well, you're in that right now. But I think the older you get and the more mature you get, the more you will look back at and be like, what are the things that have influenced that? And I think that's going to be a rest of your life thing. But it's just good to know that there are some core causes behind these things that we fear, and that we can invite God into all those and be curious about all those. So I know we covered a ton of stuff on this podcast here today, basically everybody's core fears of life and how to meet all those. So hopefully something in there was helpful to people listening. It's a really cool conversation. Alex, Shelby, thank you guys for jumping on today.
Thank
Matt, you too.
You're welcome.
We'll see you guys next time for the next edition of this podcast.